We've been for actually weeks now, many even months, talking about the potential of this Ukrainian counteroffensive. Does it now appear to be underway?
It depends who you ask. But we've seen this week sort of the narrative switch. We heard experts say it was still coming, and this week appears to be the first time where it appears that people are saying, the majority of people are saying it's arrived.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, the dam has burst in Ukraine. This has been a major development in the war. Talk a little bit about what happened and who do we think is to blame?
So earlier this week, there was an explosion at the Novokakhovka Dam, which is along the Dnipro River, which runs sort of through the southern part of Ukraine. Now, where it's located is north of Kherson. So when the dam exploded on Tuesday, we're talking significant, overwhelming amounts of water broke through the dam, flooding not just, the nearby area, but we're talking, Ukrainian officials said there are roughly 80 towns in the near, throughout this, downstream from where the dam is that are now at risk of flooding. We've seen images of water, literally to second floors of houses. We've seen, more than 10 feet of water in some places. So this has really been one of the most catastrophic events of the war. Now, it's still not entirely clear who's responsible. Like usual during events in the war, Ukraine pointed the finger at Russia, Russia pointed the finger at Ukraine.
Right.
The U.S. usually one to be pretty definitive in their support of Ukraine, actually said they're still assessing or evaluating who's responsible for this. That being said, it's important to note that this plant has been under Russian control for about a year now. And experts do believe that Russians stand more to gain from this dam breaking because there was reason to believe that Ukraine was going to use the Dnipro River, which divides Ukrainian and Russian troops, to get through and to break through that area. Now that's obviously much harder with a much wider and much less controlled environment.
So the Ukrainian government has characterized this as ecocide.
Absolutely. They have really come out strong. They've, alleged that this was an intentional decision, again with, the intent to disrupt their counteroffensive, but to also impact their, to ruin the environment for years to come, decades to come, they say, because there are now pollutants in the water. They're worried about water contamination. They're worried about, their food. How, we've seen or heard stories of cattle dying. We've heard, we've heard reports of people dying in the flooding. So this really
right. There's obviously been a great deal of flooding.
Yeah, and so we really have heard some very scary, comments coming from the Ukrainian government about how long this could last and how many people this could be impacting.
So we've been for actually weeks now, many even months, talking about the potential of this Ukrainian counteroffensive. Does it now appear to be underway?
It depends who you ask. But we've seen this week sort of the narrative switch. We heard experts say it was still coming, and this week appears to be the first time where it appears that people are saying, the majority of people are saying it's arrived. And so what that looks like is we saw Ukrainian forces attempt to pick up some ground in the Zaporizhia region, which is a little bit further up on the Dnipro River. We know this area because it's home to one of the largest nuclear power plants in Europe that has caused concern since the war began. We haven't heard much from the Ukrainians on this, though the Russians have said the Ukrainians weren't very effective in this maneuver. We have heard from a couple Ukrainian officials that they've made some incremental grounds in the Bakhmut region, which is in eastern Ukraine, which we know about because that's where really most of the frontline fighting for nearly a year now has really taken place, with Russia, winning ground at a very slow and incremental rate at a tremendously high cost for casualties.
Finally, after the debt ceiling deal was finally consummated, passed, signed into law by President Biden, there are some concerns that the spending caps will adversely affect U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Should the Ukrainians be worried?
Right now there's a lot of uncertainty, and we've heard just as much from President Zelensky. In the short term, as you mentioned, Congress has put caps on spending. It's not quite clear how that'll impact aid to Ukraine, even though President Biden remains confident that he'll be able to get it passed. But the other thing that President Zelensky has talked about is that there's a presidential election coming up. And while President Biden will almost assuredly be the Democratic nominee, we've heard a wide variety of answers from the Republican candidates about whether or not they would continue aiding Ukraine, whether they would stop aiding Ukraine, and whether or not they would try and get them to the table and be willing to make or push Ukraine to give up territory. So there really is a large range of perspectives from the Republican presidential candidates on how they would handle the Ukraine crisis, thus making a lot of future aid up in the air.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.